G'day ZiggyD here and welcome to my first impressions and analysis video for the new skill Reave. Reave is a skill that was added in patch 0.11.4 and it was designed to fill a bit of a gap in the market for AoE skills for smaller melee weapons, specifically claws and daggers, although it also works with one-handed swords. Now, it is, as I mentioned, a dexterity type gem. It has dexterity and int requirements, so the shadow is a natural choice for it, and that's why I'm rolling a shadow in this particular video here. Now, as you can see, it has an AoE that works a little bit interestingly. When you first start off using it, it has a very small conal AoE radius. It essentially shoots out a little triangle like this and curves at the end. Now, each time you attack with Reave, it builds up an additional stack up to a maximum of 8. Now, per each one of these stacks, you gain 20% more AoE radius. Now, more is multiplicative with any other AoE increases you have, so the more AoE you have, the more benefit this is going to give you. So as you can see, we've just built up 2 stacks there, and unfortunately, because I wasn't able to attack another mob quickly enough, the stacks went away. So they only stick around for a very short amount of time. It's about 2 seconds, I believe. And essentially, the way that this skill is played is a very high tempo style of play. You want to have a very high attack speed and very high move speed to be able to move between mob packs and keep that buff up as much as possible. So for example, I build up the buff here, I build it up to close to 8, and then as I get closer to 8, my AoE radius increases dramatically, and I can essentially hit mobs from very far away. Now on my passive tree on this character at the moment, I only have one of the AoE clusters here. There is another AoE cluster down here that you could get, and I've seen that with that and combined with, for example, the unique chest piece Carcass Jack, which increases your AoE even further, I'm seeing people reach just about off screen with the AoE at the 8th stage, essentially, at the 8th buff. So it can reach quite far at that stage, but the problem is keeping those stacks up, and that encourages a very unique playstyle. Now, Grinding Gear Games have said recently that they want to start putting more skills into the game that do encourage unique playstyles. A very good example of this was Searing Bond recently, which is gives you a very unique playstyle for it, definitely. I made a build based around it, and it kind of plays like Spider-Man. You kind of web sling your Searing Bond totems around, and this is quite similar. Although Reeve does have some similarities to Cleave and Lightning Strike, it still plays very differently because of this stacking buff and the speed at which you have to play to be able to keep that buff up. So let's take down this next pack and I'll talk about a few more of the mechanics. Now, as I said earlier, the stacks will reset if you don't attack for more than 2 seconds. So if I wait here, I lose all of my stacks. Now the stacks also reset if you happen to use another skill in that time. So for example, I can't start attacking and then cast my curse because that'll get rid of the stacks. So this means you have to play a little bit differently, and you have to practice with this skill if you want to get good at it, because you have to relearn your muscle memory to essentially cast all of your curse first, then build up your stacks, and then keep those stacks as much as possible, and to keep that going. So, you know, I think that requires a bit of practice. And then the other thing is that since it is a conal-based attack, it projects out in a very narrow at the closer range to you that you are. You want to build up those initial stacks as quickly as possible in melee range, so you have to get quite close to build those up. And then you want to retreat to a range a bit so that you're using your full AoE radius. So hopefully I can demonstrate on these 2 packs here. I'll build up some stacks on these zombies here. So these are all dead. I've got my 7 stacks. Then I want to attack from a bit of a range, so that way I'm hitting all of them with that full AoE there. If I were in melee range, I might be missing like zombies to my sides here and here, for example, and certainly any ones behind me. If you stay in melee range the entire time while using this skill, especially with the Multistrike support gem, a lot of the times you'll miss a lot of mobs, and your AoE won't be using it effectively, essentially. So positioning is super important with this skill, and I think it's going to require quite a bit of practice to actually use it well. Some skills, you know, are pretty simple. You just need to kind of point and shoot. But this one requires a little bit more finesse, I would say, and that I think that's pretty cool. Now, another thing that I want to mention is about targeting. With this particular skill, even when I have 0 stacks or when I have 8 stacks, if I click on a mob, I'll run up and target them in melee. Now, just to prove this, if I can, I now have 7 stacks, but even though I have that 7 stacks and I could essentially hit out this far, I still ran up when I clicked on them to hit them in melee range, and that's just because of the way targeting functions in the game. So to avoid this, the best thing you want to do is to always be holding shift whenever you're attacking. Even when you're doing it without stacks like this, I build them up with melee there. I don't have very good accuracy at the moment, so I am missing sometimes. And then you want to be holding shift and clicking to use that full AoE range, essentially. You don't want to be getting in melee range with everything. It defeats the purpose of the skill. So you have to really hold shift if you want to be able to have precise control over the skill, and I think that is really important. Now, Multistrike is going to be one of the main support gems that you use with this skill, and I just want to say something specifically about hit. If you target the ground within, outside of melee range of a mob, all three attacks will go in the same direction. This functions a little bit differently to Multistrike with other skills, where it will actually intentionally target other mobs. So for example, if I'm using it with Infernal Blow in melee range, I'm going to hit this mob and hit this mob and hit this mob, with my 3 multi-strikes, and it'll be randomly selected. But if I use it, say if I just point in that direction, all 3 attacks will go in the same direction. Now this is important once you have your stacks built up, because you want to essentially be getting all 3 of those AoEs hitting those packs as much as possible. So if you click shift click, which is pretty much already what we need to be doing, then all of those waves are going to be going in the same direction, hitting those mobs. Whereas if you get up into melee range, you're going to be firing those off into random directions and losing some of the effectiveness. So just another reason not to get into melee range, essentially. So let's just, I'll just clear up the rest of these mobs, and then I'll start talking about some specific mechanics of the skill gem, some of the stats and things like that. So I have to say, while I'm clearing these guys out, that it's a really cool looking skill. I really like the sort of force wave of it. It's kind of colourful, and it is very aesthetically pleasing when used with a crit based build like my current one. So we just leveled it up, and this is actually a good chance to mention that leveling up this skill increases the base physical damage pretty much as is with most melee skills. So let's talk about this. It is a green gem. It has dexterity and intelligence requirements. However, prior to level 5, these are very, very low. So I think any class really can use Reeve prior to level 5. Something like level 4 Reeve is fine to be used by any class. Next up is base mana cost is really low. At level 10, its mana cost is 8, which is fairly low, but you can keep this even lower if you leave it at level 4, in which case its mana cost will only be 6. So if you are playing an elemental Reeve build, then you can essentially leave this at level 4, keep the mana cost at 6, and you're only losing out on physical damage, which won't really affect you since you are an elemental build. It works very similarly to Cleave in that effect. However, unlike Cleave, it doesn't have any damage reduction, so I think the high-end damage of Reeve could potentially be a bit higher. The only thing is that I would say it's a little bit harder to use than Cleave is, and it's not quite as safe because Cleave always has that AoE, whereas with Reeve you have to build up those first initial stacks, and this is probably going to be the main thing that turns most people off this skill, because you do have to put yourself in harm's way to be able to build up those stacks and to use that full AoE. Even though the AoE potential is quite a bit higher than Cleave, you really have to get to that point first, and that involves not dying in melee range before that point. Now, next up we have, as I said before, leveling it gives physical damage. Now quality per point gives 0.5% attack speed, and this is pretty important because attack speed is super important for Reeve. The faster you can attack, essentially, the faster you're going to be able to build up those AoE stacks. Up to 8, you have to hit 8 times to get full AoE potential, and that requires quite a few hits per second. If you only have 1 attack per second, it's going to take you 8 seconds to build that up, and that is ridiculously difficult to do. So I can actually probably demonstrate just how difficult this is. I don't have slow attack speed. I'm using I'm using daggers, and I have some attack speed nodes on the passive tree. But without Multistrike, well, if I actually have to get in the range, and if I don't, one-shot mobs with crit, maybe I can find a mob pack here. It takes quite a long time to build up those stacks. So I've got 3 stacks, 4 stacks, 5 stacks, 6 stacks, 7 stacks, and now I can finally use that AoE range. Still kind of cool, but nowhere near as easy to use as it is with Multistrike. So you're either going to need very high attack speed, or pretty much I guarantee that Multistrike will be a support that everyone who uses Reeve will be using. So let's, on that note, talk about my recommended supports to try out with this skill. Obviously, this is going to depend on your build, and extra types of supports, for example, like power charge on critical, increased critical damage, and things like that, are all going to depend on your build. But what are the core ones that I think most builds can potentially use, and ones you should keep an eye out for? Now, as I mentioned, first up is Multistrike. I think Multistrike is pretty much mandatory for this skill. That more attack speed really helps with building those stacks up, and it also helps a little bit with keeping the stacks as well. I pretty much, I can't say anything bad about Multistrike in this build, because you're aiming to not use it in melee range anyway. The melee targeting isn't too much of an issue, and since you should have very high attack speed with any Reeve build, the root while you're doing those 3 attacks shouldn't be too much of a problem, because you should only be there for like about a second. Next up, another support gem I recommend would be increased AoE. Now obviously the AoE on this skill gets quite high, but with that increased AoE you can get it even further. You can shoot off screen potentially. And also worth mentioning is with increased AoE, your first attacks of AoE are a little bit longer. You know, it's still quite short, so the increase is only going to be minimal. So we might move from something like here to only just out here. But that's going to make connecting with those first few attacks that much easier. Essentially, you're going to be out of melee range, which will make it a lot easier. You'll be able to run up to, let's say this stone here is a mob. We'll be able to run to here, or maybe even a little bit further away, and use that range to hit that mob without them being able to hit us if they are a melee mob. That's going to keep you out of harm's way and make it a little bit more like cleave to use as well. It could even potentially be a better cleave with that support gem. So that's one that's well worth trying out, and I'll probably try that out as soon as I can get my hands on one of them with this character. Next up is Concentrated Effect. Obviously this is going to have the reverse effect, because Concentrated Effect is going to reduce your AoE, but if you're not having too many problems with that AoE, maybe if you've got a lot of increased AoE nodes, like you've got these ones, and you're wearing Carcass Jack, then maybe that decrease in AoE won't be such a big deal for you, or maybe you don't mind being in melee anyway, which I'm not sure how much of a penalty that will be because of the conal nature of the skill, but Concentrated Effect will be your single biggest damage increase with this skill. Since it does have that AoE tag, you are increasing all of the damage of Reeve. It doesn't have a pure melee component. All of the attacks that happen with Reeve occur out of the AoE. It's essentially like Ground Slam or Cleave in that regard. So Concentrated Effect is going to give you a ton of extra damage, and I think that will be well worth trying out. Now, I think a lot of builds are also going to be going physical with Reeve. For example, I'm going physical daggers with the conversion and crit and all that good jazz. So on that note, and since Reeve also doesn't have any physical reductions or any reductions to damage, I think melee physical damage support gem will be an excellent one to try as well. So let's go do a little bit more farming, and I'll just talk about what sort of builds I think will be using this. Now, I think, firstly, I think that sword builds are not really going to be worthwhile using Reeve with. It could be fun to make a sword Reeve build, but I think swords, you know, they already have access to cleave, which is, as I mentioned, a safer and easier to use skill. And probably I would have to admit, even without testing Reeve that much, cleave is probably a better skill overall. Just a much more reliable skill, even if Reeve is pretty cool and pretty fun. So swords, I think, will be going for Reeve, for cleave, sorry, and not Reeve. Now, on that note, what I do think, however, is that the weapons that essentially make use of Reeve, the claws and daggers, are going to fall into 2 categories of build that will really benefit from this skill. The first one is kind of what I'm going for with this one, and I think that's CI dagger builds that focus on building up a lot of crit and using that crit with Ghost Reaver and Vile Pact to keep themselves alive. I think will work really well with Reeve. You know, you're already in that area, you can get a lot of attack speed with those sorts of builds, and get all of the full benefits of Reeve pretty well. And also, I think a high level CI build with good gear and with that crit leech is going to be very able to handle melee range. I think probably the most viable melee builds at the moment are CI builds with that intense leech from critical damage. If you've got a lot of critical multiplier and you crit and you have instantaneous leech that goes to your energy shield, then you're very rarely going to be able to get hurt. You're certainly going to be immune to things like Reflect. So I think those sorts of builds will be able to make use of Reeve, because the alternative skill for those sorts of builds is essentially Multistrike or Double Strike with Melee Splash. Double Strike with Melee Splash is quite good, and Lightning Strike I personally dislike, but I know a lot of people have used it to a reasonable amount of success. Reeve is I think potentially a good skill to use with that. Another good thing I'm noting is that characters going for those sorts of builds will be able to be in the area to get AoE nodes. Now the way I've planned it out is I probably won't be able to have enough passive points to also pick up these AoE nodes here. But I can get these ones pretty easily, and they're not too far out of my way, so I'm getting a lot of benefits that synergize well with Reeve. Now, I think the other types of builds that are really going to be benefiting for Reeve are essentially claw builds that really make use of that life leech. Probably also CI builds that make use of that life leech, and use Vile Pact and Ghost Reaver again to make full use of that. I can't foresee any life builds really using Reeve that successfully, but I could be wrong, and if you have any ideas for a good life build that would work well with Reeve, I'd love to hear them. But so far I think CI will have the survivability to really make full use of Reeve, to be able to get in and build up those initial stacks safely, and to be able to, you know, use the crit that's in that particular area from daggers, or use the leech that's in that area from claws. I think those sorts of builds could work really well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. These are just my first impressions and, you know, my day 2 analysis of trying this skill. There's a lot more to learn about skills than can come out in this amount of time. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.